I need all of the time I can get. There's one other thing I need to make sure I do, because it was always really embarrassing to speak in chapel and tell the students to make certain they had their phones silenced, and then halfway through have your own phone go off. So I want to make sure that I'm obeying, I'm obedient. I'm very grateful for the work that Chris did last week in helping us continue to encounter Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. This is a bit of a challenge to try to read the Gospel of Luke as though we've never read it before. To try to meet someone, almost as it were for the first time, because many of those we're reading about were meeting Jesus for the first time. And yet we know in our heart of hearts that we have encountered him many times. So we're reading stories that we have read before. But always as we encounter Jesus, our goal is the same. That we might have recreated hearts. Create in me a clean heart, O God. That we might live in a way that life will never be the same. So that's our goal. Let's begin with a word of prayer, and we will continue our study. Father, we're grateful because we find freshness, we find renewal, we find opportunity to be remade and recreated in the power of your word continually. We're grateful for the opportunity to see afresh the way in which you have revealed yourself to us in Jesus Christ, the way in which you have worked in the lives of others. May we identify, may we see ourselves, may we be blessed spiritually that we might be a blessing to others. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, it's a little bit of a guess to be able to say with certainty exactly how the first 2 years of Jesus' ministry unfold. I do think we can say with some certainty that as we look at approximately a 3-year ministry, it's very clear biblically that the feeding of the 5,000 is the Passover before the Passover of Jesus' death. So the last year of Jesus' ministry is very easy to organize. We can see the Passover in our March, April. That in this particular slide would begin at about 5 o'clock. The feeding of the 5,000, begin the last year of ministry, begin the purple section. We know by September, October of that last year that Jesus went to Jerusalem for the feast. That would have been the Feast of Tabernacles. That would have been the Feast of Yom Kippur. That would have been the Day of Atonement. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles in the John 7 passage. We also know that in December that Jesus would have continued to minister, and by January, February, he would have been back in Jerusalem for Hanukkah, for the opportunity to think about the Feast of Lights and all of those events associated with Esther. All of those things we can pretty well understand based on John's gospel, not based on Luke's gospel. But then we can see that we're just looking at a pie chart based on the number of chapters in the gospel accounts total. But we can see that the triumphal entry over about 8 o'clock, we still have a third of the story to tell in the last week plus 40 days. But what's a little bit of a mystery, I've jumped a bit too far ahead. What's a little bit of a mystery is how to organize those first 2 years. How long did it take Jesus to choose 12 followers, 12 apostles? Seems like a few days, just reading it in Mark's gospel, for example. Just mentally trying to analyze it, surely it didn't take him over a few months, maybe 2 or 3 months, maybe 6 months at the most. And then for this pie chart, I have just artificially inserted the idea that perhaps the sea crossing, the difficult sea crossing, well, we may be a year into Jesus' ministry. Maybe not. But as we read through Luke's gospel, and we're already in Luke 8, we're going to read about the feeding of the 5,000 in Luke 9. So if you see nothing else out of this particular slide, I want you to see that we would like to know a lot more than we do about what went on in Jesus' ministry. We really have a scarcity of information. But here is where we have been. I welcome you again to our Jesus tour bus. We're trying to anticipate where he's going to be and be there when he is there. The itinerary, just thinking about where we have been, we've been traveling through Galilee and Nazareth. And actually we spent a lot of time in a little place called Capernaum. That is the village of hope. We'll talk about that in a minute. Chris reminded us of the events in Nain and also of the parables by the Sea of Galilee. Today we're going to go across the Sea of Galilee for the first time. We're going to enter Gentile territory for the first time. Jesus' ministry, perhaps for as much as a year, has been exclusively among the Jewish regions, within the Jewish regions. Now, there have been Gentiles come from Tyre and Sidon and from the Decapolis, from the 10 cities. There have been Gentiles present, but Jesus himself has not traveled to a Gentile region until we follow him there today. So we're going to cross the Sea of Galilee and go over to the region of the Gentiles, but only very briefly, into the area of either the Gergesenes or the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes. And we'll make that a little bit clearer. You can see a little bit of it on the slide. It's not really a big textual problem. It's just the fact that there was a village called Gergasa, and then there was a larger city called Gadara, and then there was the largest city, which was called Gerasa. And they're all in the same region. And it seems that that area was variously known by those 3 metropolitan or village areas, depending on who knew the area the best. Well, here's where we are as we think about our challenge. We have been spending time around the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, that's what we call it. That's Jesus' hometown now. That's his center of operations. You heard last week in Chris's study about Magdala, the city of Mary Magdalene. We ought to at least note that Tiberias was the center of the government of Herod Antipas. You can see other places there of Nazareth and so on, but this is about 60 to 70 miles north of Jerusalem in the area of first century Palestine as we think about it. But we're going to go specifically to this little place that's called Capernaum. It's the city of Nahum, we might say, but probably not. But it is, if you were to translate it, a place that for the Hebrews was known. This is hopefully something that you probably haven't heard a number of times. What does it mean to live in the village of Capernaum? Well, in the Hebrew, that was called the village of hope. Isn't that interesting? Nahum was the prophet of hope. I think that's interesting because he predicted the fall of Nineveh. But he's called the prophet of hope. His name means hope. So the village of hope. And Jesus bursts on the scene and begins his public ministry in the village of hope. on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. Now, there's a picture of the entry today, the modern entry. I took that picture. You can see they've altered their spelling a little bit. Of course, in Hebrew, F and P are the same letter, depending on whether you pronounce it hard or soft. So here you have PH to represent that. Still the case that F and P are the same letter for us. It's just that if we put an H with the P, we get an F, as in phone. Capernaum, the town of Jesus. One of the first things that caught my attention when I entered Capernaum was the grinding wheel. And I think for the first time I understood how it worked. If you had a long stick or a long, we'll call it a pole, and you were able to attach it to a yoke of oxen, and that yoke of oxen were going around and around in a circle, and you put the grain in the bowl, the rock bowl there, and you let that heavy weight roll over it, eventually you would have the grain ground. So if you've always wondered how a millstone and all of the paraphernalia worked, well, there you have it. And that rock on top is incidentally called a millstone. And you can see why Jesus said that getting a millstone tied around your neck and getting cast into the sea was not all that pleasant an experience. But it'd be better to have that experience than to offend one of the little ones. That's what he said. So Jesus again burst on the scene in this city, Capernaum, the village of hope. Now, I also liked visiting Capernaum because of the first century synagogue that exists. The ruins of the synagogue on the left, and on the right, an excavation in a part of the interior of that first century synagogue where they have reached the level of the first century synagogue, because it, over a period of time, has been built up with ruins and various earthquakes and other problems. So the excavation, at least in theory, is down to the very stones that Jesus walked across as he entered the synagogue in Capernaum. Well, I just wanted to mention Capernaum is the city of hope, and that's where we've begun. Now, about 4 or 5 miles to the northwest of Capernaum is a place that today, I'm not certain whether it's a historical site or a place of memory, but this is where they've built the church building, and this is the site, supposedly, of the Sermon on the Mount, or Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. Now, we've already gone by that. I'm just catching us up. You can see the Sea of Galilee in the picture on the right from that site. You might wonder, well, how could there be confusion between a Sermon on the Mount and a Sermon on the Plain? Is it a mountain or is it a plain? Well, probably hill would be a more accurate word for us than mountain. But here's actually what it looks like if you stand up there at the base of that church building and you look out. You can see that it does a little bit of a roll downward, but it'd be pretty easy to stand on that little hill and be able to address a lot of people in that field down there, or a little different site a little bit further west. This is a hill for a Sermon on the Mount, or is this a plain? Or is it possible for it to be both? And of course, it's possible for it to be both. It can be the same place. Sermon on the Mount, which is really more of a sermon on the hill, or the Sermon on the Plain. It perhaps depends on one's perspective in all of that. Well, as Jesus proceeds to this Sermon on the Plain, using Luke's terminology, he chooses apostles. Probably, I think, again, within a few weeks or at most a few months of beginning his ministry. And he continues that ministry in the city of Nain, which, as Chris pointed out, is probably almost a day's journey to the southwest, maybe 20 miles as we think about distances. This is a picture of the modern city of Nain. Jesus continues his ministry in chapter 7, and then, as Chris helped us last week, the parables, the Sea of Galilee. Such an intriguing place, a body of water about 8 miles wide and 13 miles north and south. And you can look all the way across it. Of course, in the picture on the left, looking across the sea, it's hard to tell whether you're looking across Fort Gibson Lake or whether you're looking 8 miles. But the boat out there in the middle kind of gives you a clue. It's quite a little ways over there. The reason it looks like that is that's a pretty good little rise, pretty good little mountain on the other side of the sea. Well, there's a picture of the fish, not the exact fish that Peter found the coins in its mouth, but almost all of the fish in the Sea of Galilee are tilapia. So when you get to eat one of the fish out of the sea at the seaside restaurant, well, I chose the fish. And you get the whole fish. If you've eaten fish in foreign countries, you probably know that. And then you can work through it as you wish. It's very well cooked. Actually, if you're kind of ambitious and not too prone to be concerned about what exactly you're eating, you can probably finish that off and leave a pretty small pile of bones to have enjoyed that. Now, the picture on the right, I find interesting. It's a bit hard to see. There is a number there. It says 208.8. And of course, then you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. The unique thing about this is the supposed normal level of the lake is 208. That's meters below sea level. And so when you go 1, 2, 3, 4, you and I have never seen in our normal experience a sign like this. We think, well, that must be down to 204. No, that's down to 212. You're going down, but you're making bigger numbers because you're getting further and further below sea level. Well, we really ought to translate it to feet. The meters don't mean much to us. So that's 600 feet and a little bit more below sea level. Very, very interesting. Now, there's a picture of the exact boat that Jan and I rode. That's a picture that would be an accurate picture of the boat that you saw out there that was so small on that other picture. And then I remember a time when it said there were a lot of little boats that had cast out from the shore. And there's a bunch of little boats that have cast out from the shore. Well, we're not going to spend much time talking about Jesus' parables. I just thought it would be interesting to see some pictures. So today, again, what we're going to do is we're going to cross the Sea of Galilee and go over to the area. Well, we've got to say something, so we'll say the Gergesenes. Now, when you start talking about crossing the Sea of Galilee, and this sets a little bit at, as you can imagine, a little bit at an angle to get the entire sea on the slide. Actually, toward the upper right would be due north. And because the Sea of Galilee, 8 miles wide again and about 13 miles north to south, actually sits almost exactly the Jordan River flowing north and south. Now, you see in this slide the problem. What does it mean when you cross the sea? We read many times about Jesus crossing the sea. But on this slide, you can see at least three different options. Are you going from basically Magdala over to Bethsaida, over to the area of Capernaum, the little black or blue at the top of the lake? Or are you going from the west side of the lake over to Bethsaida to Capernaum? Or are you going to cross over to the east side of the lake? So you have to read the road signs. You have to think about, well, where was he and where's he going? In this case, we're going to be able to say that this is what he's going to do. He's going from Capernaum, which is on the north end, the dot that's more toward the top of the slide, and he's going over to the east coast, to the area of Decapolis, the 10 cities, to the area of the Gentiles, the area of the Gergesenes. I call this the fearful sea crossing. Let me just say something. Again, this is a picture of where he started and where he's going, the area of the Gergesenes, and that little bit at the bottom that you may be able to read, but that I can't read very well, is just again explaining a little bit about that area where he went in the country of the Gergesenes. And of course, we have some idea that it was an area of the Gentiles because there was a herd of swine that eventually ran into the sea. You wouldn't have many herds of swine that would have been in the area of the Jews. So let's come to chapter 8 and verse 22. Again, our itinerary today, but let's cross the sea. We're getting off of the bus, by the way, to cross the sea. This is not a magic bus that can roll across the sea. So I thought I ought to mention that because someone will come up to me afterward that's listening real carefully and say, now wait a minute, you have a problem. So I just want to make clear that we understand how that works. But we're going to go to the other side of the lake. Now that means from the north to the east. But you still get out into the middle of the lake. And we want to see what's going to happen. One day, well, it just says one of the days within whatever was happening, Jesus said, let's go to the other side of the lake. There's no indication what time of day it is. Could have been evening, perhaps, as long as they had time to get there. Could have been during the day. But they decided to go to the other side of the lake. They got into the boat, and as they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. Now, I should have mentioned as we were working on our drawing here, perhaps you can have a sense from two things. Number one, 600 and some odd feet below sea level, but can you also begin to get a feeling for the fact that it does not matter which direction you come from, when you go to the Sea of Galilee, you're going to go down to the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is in a great big hole. And so when the wind blows, it's going to swoop down into that low area. We're talking about a low area, so it does not matter which direction it comes from. In fact, about the worst thing that can happen is for it to come from all directions. So that when you have the opposing winds coming into one another, on the Sea of Galilee, you get squalls. You get all of these opposing winds. Jesus fell asleep. The NIV says a squall came down on the lake. The boat was being swamped, and they were in peril. They were in danger. Well known. The disciples woke Jesus up. They went and roused him. The word can mean to wake up, but there's another word for wake up. They roused him in some way. They got his attention. And they said, Master, Now, they didn't say Lord, and if you think Lord and Master are the same, they said commander. They said guy in charge. It's a different word in the original language. They said, hey, you're the ones in charge here. I'm not sure why they thought he was in charge, because they were fishermen. I mean, the guys that were with him that were having trouble with this boat being swamped, they were fishermen. So they knew what it was to be out in the midst of a storm. Certainly it wasn't the first storm that they'd ever seen. We're going to drown. We're perishing is a good translation. He gets up, and I'm not certain how strong this word should be. Rebuke, perhaps. But he calms, he speaks. I kind of get more of an impression just reading it. As I was reading it again this morning, I thought, well, I'm going to read it in this other one over here too. I kind of got more of the impression of, hey, you guys over there, hold it down. You know, like when your kids, they're not terrible, but they're kind of interrupting the conversation. Hey, you guys over there, hold it down. I don't know whether he was particularly stern, but nonetheless, the winds and the waves obeyed. That's the point. The winds and the waves obeyed. The storm subsided and everything was calm. And then we could spend time, you know, it's really fun to read all of these accounts together. We can talk about, why are you so timid? Why do you have such an inadequate faith? Why do you have a faith that's not sufficient? You know, all of those kinds of things. Oh, ye of little faith. Depends on what translation you're using. But here, in Luke, he just says, where's your trust? Or maybe faith. It's all the same word in the original language. Where's your trust? Now, you know, you and I, you know what we do? We immediately accuse them of not trusting God. But they're fishermen. They've been on the lake before. I wonder if he's saying to them, you know, that wasn't all that bad, guys. So what's the deal here? Why aren't you able to stand this? Why don't you understand how boats work? Well, he's probably talking about God. I'm simply trying to get us to read through fresh eyes and say, do we automatically jump to conclusions and therefore fail to encounter Jesus? Sometimes we think the world's just about to come to an end because of the problems we face. And Jesus maybe comes to us and says, you know, this is nothing. You've not seen anything yet. You know, in counseling, in years of ministry, I'd find two couples going through exactly the same thing with two very different results. The difference was one of them didn't have any cope, and the other one did have cope. They knew how to cope. Well, that's also a matter of trust. That's also a matter of how you live your life. But their response, which is probably the primary lesson we want to get here, in the midst of their fear and amazement, and it's just the word phobos, it's just a word for fear. It could mean reverence. Here it probably means they were afraid and they were amazed. And their question is, who is this? He can give a command and even the wind and the water obey him. Now, originally we were going to stop there, but I want to go on because I want also to comment that next week, Brother Steve Teal from Baxter Institute is going to be with us, and I have asked him if he would like to take some time in the class to help us ask questions and clarify and that kind of thing, and he has graciously agreed not only to preach but also to help us in our class next week. And so he'll be here, and you'll see in the bulletin this week, hopefully, how important that work is for us. I want to speak quickly about the demon-possessed man. We may not get done. We may have to pick this up in 2 weeks. But we go to the area of the Gerasenes, and it makes it clear that we've correctly interpreted our map because it says opposite Galilee. So now we know that we went directly to the east of Galilee. So we're in the right place. He encounters a man who is demon-possessed. It just says he has had a demon for a long time. The Greek text says he has a demon. You know, possession is such a jargon word. Oh, they're demon-possessed, like they couldn't do anything about it. Well, that's another theological question for another matter, but just saying what the text says, he has a demon. So this man has a demon, and for a long time, he has not worn any outer garment. Now, he's not running around nude. Well, he could be, but that's not what the text says. It says he just wears his inner garment everywhere he goes. He never gets dressed up. Remember the young man that fled, only leaving his outer garment only in his underwear, I guess we could say. So this man has probably his inner garment. It says he doesn't have a house to live in. There's no place where he calls home. And so he lives out in an area where they do a lot of entombments. He's probably not living in a cave where somebody's already been entombed. He's probably living in an empty cave that's one day going to be a tomb. But he's living out in the area of the mountains on that raised area, and he's living out, it says literally in the tombs, or that may mean in the caves. Well, he sees Jesus, and this must be the spirit within him, the evil spirit, calling out, what do we have to do with one another? But also knowing who Jesus is, don't torture me. Jesus had commanded the evil spirit to come out. Eventually we find out that in asking about the name, there are many evil spirits. Legion, which is a word to describe a large number of soldiers, originally from the Latin, but in the Roman army. This man had been chained hand and foot, both with the shackles and with the chains on his hands, and had always broken loose, and thus had been driven by the demon into the solitary places, better than desert. So this legion of demons apparently see what they think is going to happen, because in Jewish thinking, the abyss could be a place not only for the deceased, but also for evil spirits. And so they say, we don't want to go to the abyss. Don't make us go to the abyss. Let us go over and live in this herd of pigs. Now, I want you to try to think with me in Jewish eyes before we conclude. So Jesus says, okay, go over into that herd of pigs. You can live over there. But what happens immediately? The pigs die. Now what's going to happen? There's no pigs to live in. So they're still going to go to the abyss. Have you caught that? They're still going to go to the abyss because now there's no pigs to live in. Well, of course, the rest of the story, which I think I'm going to save since the first bell has rung, the rest of the story is that the man wants to go with Jesus. Jesus says, stay here, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors. And since we're encountering Jesus for the first time, I leave you with a question or some homework. So did the man do it or not? That means you have to look up the Decapolis and this region, and when we read about it again, see if there are any believers there. Have a blessed week. Thank you for your time, your patience, your love for the Word. And next week, we'll anticipate Brother Steve Teal being with us. God bless.